When a racist CEO fires a hard-working black employee, he thinks it's the end of the story. But little does he know, this bold move will spark a journey of triumph and leave him regretting the day he let true talent walk away. Michael Carter worked quietly at his desk, his fingers flying over the keyboard as the hum of downtown Manhattan pulsed outside. The sleek corporate office where he worked was a hive of activity. Employees darted around with coffee cups in hand, their faces a blend of determination and exhaustion. The environment was polished, professional, and relentless. Every detail exuded high-pressure sophistication. Michael, a young, talented black man in his late 20s, stood out not for his appearance but for his exceptional work. His casual button-down shirt and neatly pressed slacks didn't scream Wall Street, but his diligence and innovative ideas had earned him respect among his peers. However, respect wasn't always universal. David Green, the CEO of the firm, strode through the office on one of his impromptu rounds. A man in his mid-50s with perfectly combed silver hair and a sharp navy suit, David carried an aura of command. To him, perception was everything. He believed appearances defined professionalism. As David scanned the floor, his sharp gaze landed on Michael. The young man's casual attire clashed with David's rigid expectations. For a moment, David's lips curled into a sneer, his expression dripping with judgment. To him, Michael didn't belong in this meticulously curated world. "Michael," David barked from across the floor, his tone cutting through the buzz of the office. Heads turned. Michael glanced up, his confident yet humble demeanor intact. "Step into my office. Now." Michael straightened, smoothed the creases on his desk, and walked toward the imposing glass doors of David's office. The room, adorned with expensive art and gleaming awards, reflected David's obsession with status. The CEO didn't wait for Michael to sit. "Do you understand the culture we're trying to cultivate here?" David asked, leaning forward on his desk. His tone was sharp, with an undercurrent of condescension. Michael tilted his head slightly, confused. "I believe so. My work." David cut him off with a dismissive wave. "It's not about your work. It's about how you present yourself. This isn't the place for someone who doesn't fit the image we project." Michael's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Sir, my performance speaks for itself. I've consistently delivered results." David scoffed, shaking his head. "It's not just about results, Carter. It's about alignment with the brand. Frankly, I don't think you belong here." The words hung in the air like a slap. Michael's chest tightened, but he refused to let the sting show. After a moment's pause, he nodded. "Understood." David leaned back, satisfied. "You'll need to clear your desk by the end of the day." Michael stood, his composure unshaken. "I'll do that." Without another word, he walked out of the office. Back at his desk, Michael began gathering his belongings. Co-workers nearby exchanged uneasy glances. A few whispered to one another, their faces clouded with disbelief. One colleague, a young woman who'd worked closely with Michael, leaned toward him. Her voice was soft but resolute. "You deserved better." Michael smiled faintly, appreciating the gesture. As he placed the last item into his bag, he stood tall and took one last look around. His gaze wasn't one of defeat, but of quiet determination. As he walked toward the elevator, all eyes followed him. The polished office, once alive with movement, seemed to pause. Even as the doors closed behind him, Michael's presence lingered, leaving an imprint far stronger than David's cold dismissal. The whispers started the moment Michael walked out of David's office. "Did you see his face?" someone murmured near the break room. "He looked so calm. How is he not furious?" Samantha, a junior employee barely a year into her role, leaned closer to her colleague, Eric. "Michael was the most talented guy here," she said in a low voice. "Why fire him? He brought in those major clients last quarter. It makes no sense." Eric glanced around nervously before replying. "It's David. He doesn't need a reason. If you don't fit his image of the perfect employee," Eric trailed off, shaking his head. Meanwhile, in the boardroom, David paced in front of the senior staff, his arms crossed over his chest. His tone was sharp, and his words were laced with self-assurance. "Michael Carter wasn't a good fit for our culture," David declared, pausing to let the statement hang in the air. "We need people who represent this company in every aspect. It's about more than just numbers." The room was silent. Senior managers exchanged brief, uneasy glances. None of them wanted to challenge David, though they knew the subtext behind his words. "Linda," The head of marketing cleared her throat tentatively. Michael's work has been exceptional, though. He's brought in valuable clients and led some of our most successful campaigns. It's hard to argue with results. David shot her a pointed look. Results are important, yes, but so is maintaining a cohesive image. I made the decision I thought was best for the company. The room fell quiet again. No one dared to push further. Outside the boardroom, Michael's desk was now mostly cleared. A small group of co-workers had gathered, offering hushed words of support. Samantha approached cautiously, holding a small envelope in her hands. "Michael," she said softly. "We all chipped in. It's just a little something to say thank you for everything you've done here." Michael accepted the card with a warm smile. "That means a lot," he said. His voice was steady, but there was a weight in his tone that hinted at the disappointment beneath his calm exterior. As he made his way toward the elevator, a few more employees stopped him, each offering their goodbyes. Some promised to keep in touch, while others simply gave him a firm handshake or an apologetic look. Michael stepped into the elevator, feeling the tension ease slightly as the doors closed. The ride down was quiet, giving him a moment to reflect. This wasn't the first time he'd been underestimated or dismissed unfairly, but this time felt different. When he stepped out of the building, the cool Manhattan air greeted him. Michael paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the gleaming skyscraper he had just exited. His chest rose and fell as he took a deep breath, steadying himself. "This isn't the end for me," he thought, his jaw tightening with resolve. The city buzzed around him, alive with possibilities. Michael straightened his shoulders, adjusted the strap of his bag, and began walking, though the day had turned unexpectedly. His journey was far from over. The whispers began the moment Michael stepped out of David's office. "Did you see him?" Samantha asked Eric as they lingered near the break room. He looked calm, way too calm. Eric glanced at the closed office door, lowering his voice. "I don't know how he's keeping it together. If I were him, I'd be flipping that desk." Samantha shook her head. "Michael was the most talented person here. Why fire him? It doesn't make sense." Eric hesitated, then leaned closer. "It's David. You don't have to do anything wrong to end up on his bad side. If you don't fit his idea of what a perfect employee looks like, you're out. No warnings. No second chances." Across the office, David gathered his senior team in the glass-walled conference room. He stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, exuding confidence. "Let me make this clear," David began, his tone clipped. "Michael Carter wasn't a good fit for this company. This isn't just about performance. It's about maintaining the image and culture we've built here." His words echoed in the silent room. The managers exchanged wary glances but said nothing. Linda, the head of marketing, cleared her throat. "Michael's been instrumental in several of our biggest accounts. He brought in 3 top-tier clients last year. It's hard to argue with his results." David's sharp gaze landed on her. "Results aren't the only thing that matters," he replied. "We need people who represent our company in every way, not just numbers on a spreadsheet." The unspoken meaning in his words was clear. Linda's face flushed, but she stayed quiet. No one else dared to challenge him. Meanwhile, Michael was back at his desk, gathering his belongings. His co-workers lingered nearby, whispering among themselves. Some avoided his gaze, while others wore looks of quiet sympathy. Samantha hesitated before stepping forward, a small envelope clutched in her hand. "Michael," she said softly. "We all pitched in. It's not much, but we wanted to say thank you for everything." Michael looked at the card, his lips curving into a faint smile. "That means a lot," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. As he walked to the elevator, more co-workers approached. A few offered brief handshakes or whispered promises to stay in touch. Others simply nodded, their faces etched with guilt or regret. The elevator ride down was quiet, giving Michael a moment to think. His reflection stared back at him from the mirrored walls, calm and composed. He adjusted his tie, willing himself to focus. When the doors opened to the bustling lobby, Michael stepped out into the rush of Manhattan life. The familiar chaos of the city greeted him, its rhythm offering a strange sense of comfort. He paused outside the building, the cool breeze brushing against his face. Looking up at the towering skyscraper, Michael took a deep breath, letting the tension of the moment settle. "This isn't the end for me," he thought, his jaw tightening with quiet determination. Behind him, the office continued on as if nothing had happened. Employees moved briskly, their routines unaffected. But for those who had witnessed the morning's events, the atmosphere was heavier. In the break room, Samantha and Eric continued their hushed conversation. "Do you think David even realizes how much damage he's done?" Samantha asked. Eric shrugged. "He probably thinks this will blow over. But honestly, I think Michael's the kind of guy who bounces back. David's going to regret this." Outside, Michael adjusted the strap of his bag and began walking. The city unfolded before him, alive with possibilities. Though the day had taken an unexpected turn, Michael knew his story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The whispers started almost immediately after Michael walked out of David's office. "Did you see him?" Samantha asked Eric, her voice barely above a whisper. They stood by the water cooler, their eyes darting toward the CEO's glass-walled office. He looked calm, way too calm. Eric shrugged, keeping his voice low. "Maybe he's in shock. Honestly, if I were him, I'd be flipping a desk by now." Samantha glanced around nervously before leaning in closer. He didn't deserve this. Michael was the most talented guy here. You know that. Why would David fire him? Eric sighed, his tone tinged with resignation. "David doesn't need a reason, does he? He's always been like this. If you don't fit into his perfect little mold of what an employee should look like, you're out. No warnings. No explanations." Inside the office, David stood at the head of the conference table, addressing his senior team. The blinds were slightly open, revealing his commanding stance. "I'm sure you've all heard about Michael Carter's dismissal," he began, his tone clipped and professional. "Let me make one thing perfectly clear. This decision was necessary for the company's culture and long-term vision." The managers exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. Linda, the head of marketing, cleared her throat. "Michael was instrumental in landing 3 of our biggest clients last year. His performance has been nothing short of exemplary." David's sharp gaze locked onto her, silencing the room. "Performance isn't the only thing that matters," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "This company thrives on a cohesive culture. It's about maintaining the image we've built here." The subtext was clear, and Linda's face flushed. She wanted to argue but knew it wouldn't make a difference. Around the table, the other managers sat stiffly, their silence complicit. Meanwhile, back at his desk, Michael was methodically packing his belongings. He moved with quiet determination, refusing to let his emotions show. Co-workers lingered nearby, whispering amongst themselves. Some avoided his gaze entirely, their discomfort evident. Others cast him sympathetic glances, their guilt palpable. "Michael," Samantha said softly, stepping forward with a small envelope in her hands. "We all pitched in. It's not much, but we wanted to say thank you for everything you've done for us." Michael accepted the card with a faint smile, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Thank you. This means more than you know." Eric stepped closer, his voice low. "You're going to land on your feet, man. We all know it. Don't let this place get to you." Michael nodded, his eyes scanning the room one last time. "I appreciate it. Stay strong." As he walked toward the elevator, a few more co-workers broke away from their desks. Some offered quick handshakes, while others murmured quiet words of encouragement. Michael acknowledged them all with a polite nod, his composure intact. The elevator ride down was silent, giving him a moment to reflect. His own face stared back at him from the mirrored walls, calm and steady. Adjusting his tie, Michael straightened his shoulders. When the doors opened to the bustling lobby, he stepped out into the chaos of Manhattan. The city hummed with live car horns, distant laughter, and the rhythm of footsteps on pavement. Michael paused outside the building, the cool breeze brushing against his face. The towering skyscraper loomed behind him, a stark reminder of the day's events. "This isn't the end for me," he thought, his jaw tightening with quiet determination. Across the office, Samantha leaned closer to Eric. "David thinks this will blow over, doesn't he?" Eric nodded grimly. "He always does. But you know what? Michael's the kind of guy who bounces back. I'd bet anything that David's going to regret this." As Michael adjusted the strap on his bag and started walking, the city unfolded before him. Though his career at the firm had been cut short, Michael knew this was far from the end of his story. It was the beginning of something bigger. "You're absolutely right, and I sincerely apologize for my repeated mistakes. Let me correct this. I will rewrite the section with strict adherence to the word count and ensure that every detail aligns with the given prompt. Thank you for your patience. I'll make sure this is corrected immediately. Let me start fresh and carefully craft a 1,200-word section now. One moment." Michael sat at his kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee untouched beside him. The soft hum of the city filtered through the window, but his mind was a storm. His mentor's words from the night before echoed in his head: build something better. The idea had been growing ever since David's cutting words at the office. Being dismissed so abruptly wasn't just a blow to his career, it was a reminder of the uphill battle he'd faced for as long as he could remember. But instead of despair, Michael felt something else taking root: resolve. That morning he opened his laptop and began typing. The cursor blinked back at him as he poured his thoughts into a blank document, outlining his vision for a tech startup that could transform the way businesses approach inclusion. He called it Carter Solutions, a name that carried the weight of his determination. The first step was daunting. Michael had savings, but launching a business required more than just money. It demanded belief in himself and the people who would join him. He started small, reaching out to friends and former colleagues. Most were supportive, but hesitant. One old co-worker, Derek, gave a cautious laugh over coffee. A startup? In this economy? You're bold, I'll give you that. But not everyone hesitated. Samantha, the junior employee who had whispered her support on his last day, responded to Michael's email almost instantly. When do we start? She wrote. Their first meeting was held in Michael's living room. Samantha sat cross-legged on the floor, a notepad balanced on her knee, while Michael dodged back and forth, laying out his vision. This isn't just a company, he said, his voice steady but passionate. It's a movement. We're going to prove that inclusion isn't just the right thing to do, it's smart business. By the end of the meeting, Samantha's enthusiasm matched his. I'm in, she said. All the way. The team grew slowly but steadily. Michael brought on 2 former colleagues and a young programmer he'd mentored at a community event years ago. They worked late into the night, sharing pizza and stories as they built the foundation of Carter Solutions. The work was grueling. Michael's days started at dawn and often stretched past midnight. He pored over spreadsheets, pitched potential clients, and fine-tuned their software. There were moments of dark nights when he stared at the ceiling, wondering if he was in over his head, but every setback fueled his resolve. Investor meetings were among the most frustrating hurdles. Michael quickly learned that the business world wasn't as merit-based as he'd hoped. At one meeting, an investor flipped through Michael's pitch deck with barely concealed disinterest. Your ideas are interesting, he said, his tone patronizing. But we typically fund more established entrepreneurs. Michael clenched his jaw, swallowing the sting of the implication. He had expected challenges, but the subtle biases were harder to brush off than he'd anticipated. Still, he refused to let rejection deter him. He revised his pitch, practicing it late into the night with Samantha offering feedback. Together, they refined every detail, turning setbacks into opportunities to improve. Their persistence paid off when they met Elena Rivera, a progressive investor with a reputation for backing innovative startups. From the moment Michael began his presentation, Elena leaned forward, her interest evident. By the time he finished, she was smiling. I like what I'm hearing, she said, extending her hand. Let's talk about next steps. That moment marked a turning point. With Elena's backing, Carter Solutions gained momentum. Their first big break came from a mid-sized company struggling to overhaul its outdated hiring practices. Michael's platform streamlined their recruitment process, helping them build a diverse and talented workforce. Word spread quickly. More companies reached out, intrigued by Carter Solutions' promise of innovation and inclusivity. Michael and his team worked tirelessly, juggling new clients and fine-tuning their software. Within a year, Carter Solutions had outgrown Michael's living room. They moved into a modest office space, where the team celebrated their first 6-figure deal with takeout and champagne. But it wasn't just about the money. For Michael, every milestone was a testament to their mission. He wanted to prove that diversity wasn't just a buzzword, it was a competitive advantage. As the company's reputation grew, so did Michael's. Industry conferences began inviting him to speak, and he found himself standing on stages before packed audiences. Diversity isn't a liability, he told one crowd. It's an untapped resource. When we embrace it, we unlock potential we didn't even know existed. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Michael's thoughts were already on the future. He wasn't just building a company, he was building a legacy. One day, as Michael reviewed client proposals at his desk, Samantha knocked on the door. You'll want to see this, she said, handing him a document. Michael scanned it, his brow furrowing. It was a partnership proposal from green company David's firm. For a moment he froze, memories of his dismissal flashing through his mind. But then he smiled. "This," he said, setting the paper down, "is just the beginning." David sat in his corner office, the Manhattan skyline stretching behind him like a silent reminder of what he was slowly losing. His desk was cluttered with untouched paperwork, client contracts awaiting renewal, and a mug of coffee gone cold. Outside his office, the usual hum of productivity had dulled, replaced by an eerie quiet. "Another resignation," his assistant announced, placing a letter on his desk. David sighed, rubbing his temples. "Who is it this time?" "Samantha," she replied softly, avoiding his gaze. That name stung. Samantha had been one of his best employees, a rising star with unmatched work ethic and insight. She had always gone above and beyond, even in the face of his unreasonable demands. But her departure wasn't a surprise. Over the past few months, employees had been leaving in droves, citing the same reason in their exit interviews: a toxic work environment. David's leadership style, once seen as firm and efficient, was now viewed as domineering and outdated. Clients, too, were slipping through his fingers. Complaints about his unwillingness to adapt, combined with whispers of his biases, were making their way into board meetings. "They'll come back," David muttered to himself after his assistant left. "They always come back." But they didn't. Instead, the defections continued, leaving his once thriving firm teetering on instability. The board had begun to notice. At the last meeting, they had openly questioned his decisions, something they'd never dared to do before. "You need to address these issues, David," one member had said, her tone sharp. "The world is changing, and so must we." He had nodded curtly, but inside, he dismissed their concerns. David believed in his way, the way that had brought him success for years. Change? It felt like surrender. It wasn't until a quiet afternoon, while scanning industry news online, that David came across an article that made his chest tighten. The headline read, "Michael Carter's startup revolutionizing corporate diversity solutions." David stared at the screen, his breath catching. He skimmed the article, each word hitting harder than the last. Michael's company had not only gained significant traction, but had also secured a massive deal with a major corporation, a corporation that David's firm had been courting for months. "This can't be real," David muttered, leaning closer to his computer. A knock at his door pulled him from his spiraling thoughts. One of his senior managers entered, holding a printed version of the same article. "Have you seen this?" the manager asked cautiously. David waved the printed pages in the air. "Yes, I've seen it." "Michael's really making waves," the manager said, his tone laced with something that sounded almost like admiration. "I heard their platform is exactly what clients are looking for right now. Innovative, inclusive." David cut him off. "Temporary success," he snapped. "That's all it is. These flashy startups burn out as quickly as they rise." But his words lacked conviction. Despite his outward dismissal, David couldn't ignore the truth. Michael was succeeding where he was failing. The startup David had written off as a pipe dream was now a direct competitor, and a formidable one at that. Over the following weeks, Michael's name seemed to pop up everywhere. Industry conferences, glowing reviews in trade publications, and social media buzz all pointed to one thing: Michael Carter was the future, and David Green was becoming a relic of the past. The final blow came during a tense board meeting. "We need to talk about Carter Solutions," one member said, sliding a report across the table. "They've taken 3 of our major clients in the last quarter." David's face reddened as he flipped through the report. "They're offering gimmicks," he argued, slamming the paper down. "Those gimmicks are solving problems we've ignored," another member shot back, "and our clients are noticing." For the first time, David felt his control slipping. The room, once filled with deference to his authority, now buzzed with thinly veiled frustration. "You need to modernize," the chairwoman said firmly, her gaze locking on David, "or step aside." That night, David sat alone in his dimly lit office, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He thought back to the day he had fired Michael. At the time, it had felt like a simple decision, a necessary one, to preserve the culture he valued so highly. But now, as he stared at the glowing skyline, the irony was impossible to ignore. Michael, the employee he had dismissed as unfit, had become the embodiment of everything his firm was lacking. David reached for his phone, scrolling through the news. Another article about Michael caught his eye, this one featuring a photo of him at a conference. Michael stood at the podium, poised and confident, addressing an audience with the same determination David had failed to recognize. A pang of something unfamiliar twisted in David's chest. Was it regret? Jealousy? Fear? He couldn't tell. One thing was clear, the tables had turned. And for the first time, David wasn't sure how to win. The tension in the room was electric. David sat at the head of the polished oak table in his firm's conference room, flanked by his senior staff. Across from them, the representatives of one of the most coveted clients in the industry waited expectantly. This pitch wasn't just another meeting, it was a lifeline. David knew his firm couldn't afford to lose this account. His palms were clammy as he adjusted his tie and leaned forward. "Let's begin," the client's CEO said, gesturing toward David with a polite but detached smile. David launched into his presentation with the practiced confidence of a man who had done this 100 times before. His slides were crisp, his points polished, but something was off. His delivery felt mechanical, his tone hollow. Across the table, Michael Carter sat calmly, a small but noticeable presence that radiated quiet confidence. When it was his turn, he didn't rely on flashy visuals or over-rehearsed lines. Michael spoke from the heart. "Your company doesn't just need another service provider," Michael began, his voice clear and steady. "You need a partner who understands your values, your goals, and your challenges. That's what we bring to the table." His words were simple but struck a chord. Michael shared stories of how his startup had transformed other businesses, weaving in his own journey of resilience and determination. "What sets us apart," he continued, "is that we don't just innovate for innovation's sake. We innovate to make workplaces inclusive, efficient, and meaningful for everyone." The room was silent for a moment. Then the client's CEO leaned back in his chair, visibly impressed. David, however, was seething. He interrupted, forcing a chuckle. "That's all well and good, but experience matters too. We've been in this industry for decades. Can you really trust a newcomer to handle an account of this size?" Michael met David's glare with an unflinching gaze. "Sometimes a fresh perspective is exactly what's needed," he replied, his tone even but firm. The air was thick with unspoken tension as the meeting concluded. A week later, the announcement came. The client released a statement publicly confirming their decision to partner with Michael's company. The words were a direct blow to David. "We were impressed by Carter Solutions' innovative approach and their commitment to values-driven leadership. We're excited to work with a partner who truly understands our vision." The news spread quickly through industry circles. Michael's name was now synonymous with innovation and integrity, while David's firm was left scrambling to explain yet another lost opportunity. David sat in his office, the announcement glowing mockingly on his computer screen. His staff avoided eye contact, their silence louder than any words could have been. For the first time, David felt something he hadn't in years: humiliation. The industry gala was a glittering affair, hosted in a grand ballroom adorned with crystal chandeliers and velvet drapes. It was an event where the who's who of the business world gathered to celebrate achievements, network, and, for some, nurse their egos. David entered the room with a forced smile, his confidence a fragile mask. He was determined to salvage what was left of his reputation. Then he saw Michael. Standing near the bar, Michael was surrounded by a small group of admirers, laughing and chatting easily. He looked every bit the rising star he had become. David hesitated, then made his way over. He rehearsed his lines in his head: congratulate him, show humility, and maybe, just maybe, plant the seed for a potential collaboration. "Michael," David said, extending a hand. "Congratulations on your success. It's well deserved." Michael turned, his expression polite but guarded. He shook David's hand, his grip firm. "Thank you, David. I appreciate that." David cleared his throat, searching for the right words. "You've really made a name for yourself. I was thinking, maybe there's a way for our firms to work together in the future. You know, pool our strengths." Michael tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Pool our strengths," he echoed. "That's an interesting thought." There was a pause, just long enough to be uncomfortable. Then Michael added, "Funny how things come full circle, isn't it? Respect isn't just good business, it's the right thing to do." David's face flushed, the weight of Michael's words settling heavily. He nodded mutely, his usual sharp retorts nowhere to be found. As Michael walked away, the chatter of the gala faded into the background. Each step felt lighter, like shedding the weight of past injustices. His journey hadn't been about proving anyone wrong, it had been about proving himself right. He paused by a window, gazing out at the city lights. The skyline, with its endless possibilities, mirrored his own trajectory. Michael knew there were still battles ahead, but this moment was a testament to what resilience and authenticity could achieve. Across the room, David stood frozen. He watched Michael interact effortlessly with industry leaders, his own thoughts swirling. For years, David had equated success with control, power, and exclusivity. Tonight, he realized how narrow his perspective had been. Michael's triumph wasn't just a personal victory, it was a signal to everyone watching. The corporate world was changing, and those unwilling to evolve would be left behind. Later that evening, as Michael prepared to leave, a young entrepreneur approached him. Her voice was nervous but filled with admiration. "You're an inspiration," she said. "How did you keep going?" Michael smiled, his answer simple yet profound. "By knowing my worth and refusing to let anyone define it for me." The silence of an empty office late at night was deafening. David Barnes sat at his desk, head in his hands, the glow of his computer screen casting harsh shadows on his face. The board meeting earlier that day replayed in his mind like a broken record. "Your leadership style is driving us into the ground," one member had said, cutting through the usual polite veneer. David had no defense. He knew they were right. For the first time in years, he admitted something he had long ignored. His arrogance, his narrow view of leadership, his unspoken bias, they had all played a part in the firm's downfall. The next morning, after another restless night, David stared at his phone. His fingers hovered over Michael Carter's name. A pang of shame coursed through him. Michael was the last person he wanted to face, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. Finally, he dialed. When Michael answered, his tone was polite but distant. "Michael, it's David," he began, his voice faltering. I owe you an apology." A pause. Then Michael replied, "I'm listening." David took a deep breath. "I was wrong. About everything. You were one of the best talents we had, and I let my own biases blind me. I dismissed your potential without even trying to see it. I regret it more than I can say." Michael listened, his silence heavy but patient. David continued, "I know an apology won't fix what I did, but I want to change. I need to change." Michael's response was measured, each word deliberate. "Apologies are a start, David, but they're not enough. Change takes effort. Words mean little without action." David nodded, even though Michael couldn't see him. "I understand," he said quietly. Michael softened slightly. "If you're serious, focus on doing better. Not for me, but for everyone else who deserves more than what you gave me." The call ended, but Michael's words echoed in David's mind. They became his mantra as he began taking steps to rebuild not just his company, but himself. He started small. He reviewed the company's hiring practices, realizing how skewed they were toward a narrow definition of culture fit. He worked with HR to implement new policies aimed at inclusivity and equity. Next, David enrolled in diversity and leadership training programs. Sitting in a room full of people willing to challenge their biases was humbling. For the first time, he listened instead of commanding the room. The changes at the company were gradual, but noticeable. Employees began to feel heard. Samantha, one of Michael's former colleagues, even reached out to commend the effort, though she remained firmly planted at Michael's thriving startup. David's firm regained some stability, but it was clear it would never match the heights Michael had reached. David didn't mind. For once, it wasn't about winning. It was about doing what was right. Michael's name was no longer just associated with innovation, it had become a symbol of change. His company had grown exponentially, a testament to his vision and resilience. But success for Michael was never just about profits or recognition. In a brightly lit office, surrounded by his team, Michael signed the papers for a new initiative, scholarships for underprivileged youth. The program would cover tuition, mentorship, and internships at his company. As he set the pen down, he smiled. "Let's make sure the next generation has opportunities we never dreamed of," he said to his team. His efforts didn't stop there. Michael launched mentorship programs for aspiring entrepreneurs, focusing on those from marginalized backgrounds. He traveled the country, speaking at schools and community centers, sharing his story. His message was clear: talent and hard work should define success, not appearances or biases. Meanwhile, David Barnes watched from the sidelines. His company had stabilized but never regained its former glory. Every victory felt like a small step toward redemption, but the weight of his past missteps lingered. David had become an unlikely advocate for change. He spoke at industry panels about the importance of equity and accountability, often using his failures as cautionary tales. "It's not easy to admit when you've been wrong," he'd tell audiences, "but it's necessary if we want to move forward." Though his guilt never fully left him, David found solace in his efforts to make a difference. The Leadership Summit was the pinnacle of Michael's year, a global event bringing together innovators and executives. The room buzzed with anticipation as Michael stepped onto the stage for the keynote speech. He began simply, "I've seen what happens when people are overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed. I've been that person." His voice carried the weight of his journey, resonating deeply with the audience. But success isn't about climbing over others, it's about lifting as you rise. Let's build a world where everyone gets a chance to shine. The room erupted in applause. Among the crowd, David stood, clapping sincerely. His face carried a mixture of pride and regret. Michael spotted him and gave a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement of a shared understanding, the power of change and the importance of using it to create a better future.